Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Richardson, and this is Not a Pipe podcast. Today, it is my pleasure to share an interview I conducted a few months ago with Sorcha Ní Fhlainn, a lovely name, and I hope I'm saying it right. She is working on vampires and cultural studies, and her book, Postmodern Vampires, Film, Fiction, and Popular Culture, is just a super cool, interesting, and insightful work. I know I say this, I realize, about a lot of books, but it's true that it doesn't matter whether you like vampires or whether you're into them. It's a profound read for anyone interested in cultural studies and the kind of work that is done in cultural studies. So definitely I recommend it, and I look forward to sharing this interview with you. Ní Fhlainn is a senior lecturer in film studies and American studies at Manchester Metropolitan University in the United Kingdom. She is a founding member of the Manchester Centre for Gothic Studies, and she has published widely on socio-cultural history, subjectivity, and postmodernism in film studies, American studies, horror studies, and popular culture. As I'm sure you can tell from the interview you're about to hear, she must be one of the coolest professors any student gets to work with. I can just tell based on her interests and the way that she approaches the material. It's infectious and super interesting. As always, don't forget to check out tinapp.org, where you can follow Sorcha and see what books she recommends, as well as all the other interviews that I've done. I can't believe it, but it's in the high 70s right now. It'll be 100 before we know it, and I really appreciate everyone listening to the podcast and supporting it in whatever way you can, even if that's just retweeting about it or telling your friends to check it out. Of course, leaving a review is always more than welcome, especially if they're good reviews, which I very much appreciate. So Sorcha, thank you so much for talking to me today. Your book is just fascinating. Postmodern Vampires, Film, Fiction, and Popular Culture. Maybe we can start with how this came about and what it is you set out to do in the work.
The idea for the book, Postmodern Vampires, came to me, I think I was finishing my undergraduate studies, perhaps beginning my master's, and I was reading vampire books for fun. I've always loved vampire fiction. I just found them completely fascinating. And when I was reading this kind of material just for pleasure, I started to notice that what intrigued me most when I was picking up these books to read was the inclusion of the vampire's voice was what really kind of had me fascinated, because it sets up that really interesting question of, if I could live forever, what would I have to say about my experience? Mm-hmm. So that was what intrigued me. So I was very much in reading Anne Rice in particular, because she had so brilliantly kind of captured that essence of subjectivity. And then it went through essentially as my doctoral thesis. I spent years working on it as a doctorate, for my doctorate. And then as I kind of honed it down, I discovered that, it had very strong political overtones. I was a student in history and politics in my undergraduate studies, and I just noticed that the political sway of vampirism really tended to ebb and flow alongside American presidencies. And this is not necessarily completely unique to my research. It has been identified by the great Nina Auerbach, who was a fantastic vampire scholar herself. She had noticed that this ebb and flow had occurred alongside particular presidencies. But when I dug into it deeper, I noticed that it was actually in some cases, down to particular policy, or sometimes down to a particular representation of particular American presidents. So that became the focus, particularly of the afterlife of doctoral study, which when I started to embark upon putting together this book. The whole concept of vampires and their voices is a really exciting one. It continues to enthrall me. So the idea that they actually can not only narrate particular points of view in cultural history or perspective, but also in turn can represent not only the underdog, but the populist as well, so that they shift themselves sometimes between texts, between positions on the left or positions on the politically right, and they can imbue extremes of those examples as well. So it's a very interesting and diverse motley crew of the undead, I think, that I was trying to organize in this book.
Yeah, I mean, and there's lots to unpack about your arguments and the things that you look at. Maybe we can start though with your amazing cover by it's Alex Ross, right? That did that?
Yes,
Yeah,
it's Alex
who's
Ross.
amazing. I mean, that's a little bit of a connection. I mean, I'm so into Batman, and he's so well known for some of his Batman covers. But yeah, I mean, so this is George W. Bush as vampire preying on Lady Liberty, which, I mean, obviously speaks to a number of ideas in your book. Maybe you could say a little bit about that image, but also what it embodies, in the larger scheme of things.
Absolutely. I came across that image actually years ago. It was a cover on the Village Voice around the time that, let me just think now. So it was around the time there was still discussions about the kind of after effects of the Patriot Act. It was alongside a review of Nixonland. Brilliant kind of exhaustive study on President Nixon. I think that what was really interesting about it was this image kind of consolidated two very different representations of power in the traditional Gothic sense of the vampire and obviously draining Lady Liberty, which was Alex Ross himself had said that this was very much a protest image in reaction to the after effects of the Patriot Act. But equally, it kind of summates the whole idea of the president as vampire, the president feeding off the lifeblood of the masses, what Nina Auerbach described as the gaze that is bestowed on vampires, and vampires have this power to gaze back at their prey. So it shows up the kind of symbiosis between vampire and president. They kind of assimilate those images as well. So it was a very powerful image, and I was very, very fortunate Alex allowed me to use it for this book. And I think that it was possibly the most arresting image I could have because it summated so many of the issues I was trying to bring to the surface in the book. The image itself is, as I say, it is one of protest, but it is also very much an image of your vampire is a president, and your presidents are vampires. I thought that was kind of nice. It kind of nicely brought it all together in a way that made it fun and certainly visually quite arresting for a cover.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, as you mentioned, that it can kind of go in different directions even when applied to the president. So yeah, the president, Democrat, Republican in the US at least, could both be vampiric. And so the different discourses get applied, but in somewhat different ways. Maybe you could say a little bit about that. Like, it seems ideologically like right-wing and left-wing politicians in particular, and then you could take this discourse, I guess, further into the different political realms, but it seems like they wouldn't both fit vampires, and yet they kind of do in the popular discourse.
Yeah, they absolutely do. I mean, it depends on the period in which you're speaking about, but vampires in earlier sort of materials that I look at, so from the late 1960s onwards, they are infiltrators. They come in and sort of want to capitalize upon the chaos of the late 1960s and early 1970s. They want to have that sort of Nixonian sense of secrecy and power and domination, and find that under the kind of pressures of cultural upheaval at the period that they cannot really apply old world values to this new world post 1968. And then as we go through the variations, we find that vampires take on the mode of celebrity in the 1980s, very much in response to, the popularity of MTV, but also Reagan as the great communicator, Reagan as this pop culture president who can quote fluently from films as much as he, dictates policy. So it was quite interesting to see that alongside the sort of transformation of the image of the president in popular media, we too see this trickle down to, either the new Draculas or indeed the new burgeoning vampires of the 1970s who don't have that European aristocracy behind them. I think you find that they're still subject to the sway of culture, but equally they are also trying to embody what they believe power to be, and that in itself is a shifting sort of sands beneath their feet. So they're sometimes very lost, as in the case of Louis in Into the Vampire. He's very lost about who is he, where does he come from, how's it going to work out for him. But in turn, you find that other vampires like Lestat, they don't really care about that. They just want to live in the moment and seize power while they have the chance. The vampiric sense of this is that we have different factions within the community that want to either change policies or change issues that deeply affect their lives, and we have other people who say we just need to live in the moment, live now, because the rest of the world is in chaos, especially in the aftermath, say, of 1968, but also in the 1970s when you're looking at economic stagflation or you're looking at crises and conflicts. I'm thinking of Jimmy Carter's Malaise speech, for example. What is it to be American? How are we coping with this sense of despair in the culture at large? So a lot of them do map on quite culturally, quite neatly. I'm not saying it's necessarily cause and effect, but it's rather, I think, to do with like a lightning rod and the culture at the time. And because vampires are the only monsters that truly speak, and when they speak, they're always giving away secrets about who they are, what their desires are. They're very human in that respect. I think what you find is that they they tell the truth long before the truth filters up to the more culturally elite products of the period, the prize-winning writers, the Oscar-winning films. You tend to find it's more likely to be in the depths of horror and Gothic, where the despair tends to accumulate. That's where you find vampires tend to narrate these anxieties first.
I mean, it's something that I know vaguely of these things. Obviously, I've seen Interview with the Vampire and stuff, but I hadn't really thought about it in the way that you do in this book, which is really illuminating in a number of ways. I'm wondering about empathy, though. You have that funny line about Otto from The Simpsons saying when he's
Yes.
when he's looking at The Simpsons bookshelf, asking if they have any books written from the vampire's point of view. But it seems like, as you say in the book, it kind of points to two things. One being that vampires are sort of pop culture, folk culture, but low culture, generally speaking, compared to like the high values of high art or what have you. But also that they allow a kind of back and forth between identification and not, right? Because most monsters people see as complete others, whereas vampires in many ways there's a sort of empathy and seduction that other monsters don't have. And so, I mean, there's a number of things I'd like to ask you about that, but maybe we could just start with like the identification with vampires. Like, how has that worked, and has that changed over time? Because I think, as you'll explain, it's changed in how we identify with them when you look back historically, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the Otto example, I think, is a great one, simply because it is actually a real memory I do have. I remember, when Otto asks, do you have anything written from the vampire's point of view? That immediately tells you that there are loads of books written from the vampire's point of view because it's made into a joke in The Simpsons. But also it tells you that, is this the unthinking approach to Gothic literature, in the sense that if Otto's going to read it, it can't really have much value. And this is the joke in and of itself. I found that it spoke to me as quite a young viewer at the time, to say that there's stuff written from the vampire's point of view. That's brilliant, because, what do vampires do? They offer you a sense of power, a sense of immortality. You're unbound by time. You would feel much more fearless. I think that the idea of being powerless, whatever that might be, being a child, being bullied, being targeted in some way, feeling that you have no stake in society, pardon the pun. I do think that actually vampires enable you to feel like you can have a heightened sense of yourself. You have a greater sense of power and authority. And vampirism does achieve that through the obvious things like physicality and seduction and being able to, command armies or to change shape or whatever it might be. In the case of vampires more generally, the evolution of vampires have changed substantially across the 20th century in particular, and that's largely thanks to cinema. But when they come into the American imaginary in quite a substantial way in the late 1960s, and I think the film that really achieves this initially is Roman Polanski's Dance of the Vampires. Because at the very end of it, while it's certainly in dialogue with Hammer films and is basically parodying the Hammer aesthetic, what it's also doing is saying that vampires being tucked away in a random castle somewhere in the snowy mountains, that is the Gothic of old. What happens when it gets out like a virus? What happens when it spreads uncontrollably? And this is the very end of Polanski's film, where he talks about it's just going to spread everywhere. And no matter how much you try and contain it, it just becomes more uncontainable. So I think that what's really going on there is the idea that we all see ourselves in some capacity as different, as not belonging, whether we publicly or privately feel that way. And vampirism speaks to the idea of it's great to be different. Own that difference, because that difference is you are the only constant in your immortal life, the fact that you are who you are. So vampirism enables you to heighten that and not be afraid of it. And I think that's why it appealed to a lot of readers when they read Rice and many other authors in the 70s. The other thing I think that it really does as well is that because vampires are so visual, what you tend to find is that they become, with this acquisition of a voice or an acquisition of power and authority through having a voice, they tend to become younger. They tend to become far more dashing and romantic and sexy. And then as we get to the 80s, they become teenagers. So it goes along with that kind of economic power that is tracked through, where we used to think of authority as something that was very much in the hands of aged patriarchs. It then starts to seep down into the younger generation who have access to money, access to influence and power, and then it goes on from there. And women, of course, but women remain largely marginalized. I think in vampire studies, it tends to be more likely to focus on men dealing with different forms of patriarchal power and negotiations of power. So there's a huge shift. There's lots of shifts in terms of gender, in terms of access to power and influence, but then also giving voices as well. One of the things that the vampire does so well in the 60s and 70s, it gives voice to marginalized others. And that otherness can be around gender and sexuality, but equally about the idea of the impoverished and those who live under some form of tyranny, and then how they can speak back to the void and give their own point of view, which subjectivity does. It arms them with a voice that has gone unheard.
Yeah, no, I'm wondering also about the whole idea of vampire studies, because it seems like it's more and more accepted, and this goes hand in hand, I think, with a lot of cultural studies and pop culture studies, where it's no longer such a crazy thing to think that academics can look critically and with nuance at a subject that, yeah, traditionally hasn't been very sort of high culture. So people who in one department might be studying Shakespeare, it's not so strange, I think, today for people to also be studying Anne Rice and representations of vampires and things like that. But how much of this... Well, first of all, maybe you could say a little bit about your experience. Like when you introduce yourself and the work that you do, is it primarily positive, or is it positive in some places, like maybe a cultural studies conference, but maybe negative if you're at a sociology meeting or something? Maybe you could say a little bit about, the reception of studying vampires.
I think it always depends on who does the asking, isn't it? I mean, when I was starting off, when I was doing this as a PhD, I remember I was in another university as a student just graduating, and I was spoken to as though I had, I was committing murder at night because I was interested in vampires, which I thought was quite funny because I thought it was an incredibly short-sighted way to look at it. But then when I found my alma mater, when I found my other university and I pitched it to my prospective supervisor, he said to me, "That's great. Why wouldn't you want to do that?" I'm like, exactly. So I think it's sometimes about speaking to people who understand what you're trying to do and what you're trying to say. Obviously, if you're looking at something like folkloric vampirism, you're looking at much, different types of oral accounts or indeed practices, burial practices, things like that. You're looking at a different emphasis and approach that is rooted in more traditional forms of scholarship, I think. Vampire studies really has exploded, I think, because in the 1980s, I would argue more so than any other period, you had this kind of resurgence of interest in Gothic and horror studies, and its legitimacy, while I don't think was fully achieved until the late 1990s, its legitimacy in the halls of academia began to gain traction. And I think that by the end of the 1990s, you had people like myself and some of my colleagues today who were coming through university as undergraduates who wanted to study this form of critical analysis and cultural history. I still think when I introduce myself to people, I don't necessarily bring up the vampires all the time, but I do sort of talk about, I work on popular culture, I work on popular film and literature, and I work in Gothic studies. And Gothic studies seems to be the thing that people latch onto and say, "Oh, what about Gothic studies?" And I say, well, I'm very interested in the monsters point of view. I'm very interested in why we consider them to be monsters, because perhaps when we understand their subjective experience, we understand them to actually maybe be tragic anti-heroes rather than necessarily monstrous others. And you'll notice in popular culture, a lot of revisions to popular discourses that we are experiencing today in film is about taking the monster's point of view and inverting it or looking at it from a different perspective. And that's as wide and as varied as something like a Maleficent, for instance, all the way through to Cobra Kai. I don't know if you're watching that on Netflix, but we're seeing the story from Johnny Lawrence's point of view in The Karate Kid.
Yeah, I knew it was out, but I hadn't seen that.
Oh, it's magnificent. I absolutely adore Cobra Kai. I'm working a lot at the moment on my next monograph, which will be a couple of years away, but I'm working on the 1980s, and the fact that we are looking at something like a story like the Karate Kid, which on the first viewing looks so black and white in terms of the good guys and the bad guys. When you actually complicate it and look at the motivations of characters, rewrite those motivations, that's when you start to see the complexity of character and suppression and violence and masculinity and all those other things come to the surface. And that's what interests me in the Gothic studies perspective, how to understand, not necessarily always empathize, because there are stories like in the case of maybe serial killers where you go, I can't understand why they've done what they've done, but I might try and see that there's a human underneath that kind of blanket term of monster that actually alienates. I think it's more interesting to see the human elements that have informed perhaps their apparent crimes.
Yeah, it also makes me think a little bit about, I mean, obviously it's quite different, but I know some people working on religious studies, and I know some people working on things like, my partner, for example, looks at spiritualism as a historical moment, in particular when women were sort of given more voice, but through certain constraints. And it makes me think that studying vampires is similar in the sense that some people might say that they study vampires and they're really interested on some level in like proving the reality of it. Whereas other people would be, I think, much more like yourself, where you're looking at this sort of cultural discourses and the mutations over time and history and how they become articulated. I guess there's that whole thing where you kind of have to answer, maybe you do, maybe you don't. But I feel like sometimes people are like, well, are vampires real, or is this stuff real? And then they get into that stuff, which can be, I'm sure, quite difficult, because maybe you want to answer that, but maybe that's also just something you don't want to participate in. So yeah, I'm wondering how you negotiate, like if you're studying vampires, what exactly are you studying? Like, are you studying the sort of cultural articulations that vampires help us see, or would you put it in a different way? What does it mean to study vampires?
What it means for me personally is the idea of studying the vampires, sort of, as you say, a cultural articulation. They are an embodiment of a particular human fear, but also I think human desire, and how that is a very potent metaphor for the anxieties and the desires of the age in which they're produced. So vampires are like a very interesting and contradictory form of sort of like a time capsule. They embody within them this essence of the era in which they are created, but they are also, when I say they're contradictory, they're also timeless. So they have this interesting contradiction where they bring with them in their own stories and in their own embodiment, they bring with them the past. The past has always been brought up to date, and it is that contradiction between them being up to date with a vengeance, as Jonathan Harker describes Dracula, but in the same time, they very much are the embodiments of the fears and anxieties of the particular moment in which they were created. So we have this really interesting sort of frisson between timelessness and being up to date. They have both of those contradictions. They embody both those contradictions. I've been asked, do vampires exist? I've been asked that, and I'm no folklorist. I have looked into some vampire folklore for sure, and I'm particularly and continue to be indebted to the brilliance of Paul Barber, who wrote Vampires, Burial and Death back in 1988. I think it's an absolutely incredible study on practice of ancient sort of burial practices and vampires and warding off vampires and the like. But in all honesty, if they do exist, I'm very disappointed they haven't knocked down my door, because I think I've proven myself worthy. However, I also think that there are people who believe they are real and do actually bring a lot of suffering onto themselves in terms of, it's obviously not safe to drink blood. It's obviously not safe to injure yourself or anyone else for that matter. I think that there are psychotic illnesses that come with the belief of vampires as well. Yes, I'm sorry to say it has always been while I have desired to join the realms of the undead, alas, it has not happened. And I think there's a reason for that. I think they're better in the cultural imagination. A bit like the zombie. You wouldn't want the zombie to be knocking down the door either,
Yeah. Although if you were a vampire, you might say that just to, get people off your track.
Yeah, I might just want to be keeping it very close to my chest. Yeah, I understand.
But I think that's also, though, a challenge, because you might get inadvertently lumped in with people who are like that, right? Who are adamant that vampires exist, or who are really about sort of truth-telling and not particularly interested in the cultural articulations that scholars would do, which is why I think it can look bad to some people, not to myself, but the idea of studying this is not a worthy subject, because it gets lumped in with these people who do have either psychotic issues or just, are not very nuanced in their cultural approaches. So is there a way that you've negotiated that? Like when you're working on things, when you're representing things? I'm just thinking, actually, if there was let's say there was a vampire conference or something, is there a certain level of this checks out, or no, this is not the kind of conference I want to go to? Like, how do you negotiate your position in this really large discourse?
I think it comes down to, in terms of just, if you're asked, well, what does it mean to be like a vampirologist or a vampire studies expert? I think the way I always kind of negotiate that with other people, whether they're in my field or not, is just to say that, I study the meaning of it, why it's important, and why it continues to endure across hundreds of years in terms of our oral traditions, our folklore, and obviously contemporary popular culture. I think the interesting thing is that, that usually sums it up quite nicely. I think that the thing that really changed the game for me in discussing this with other people, where you weren't, regarded as someone who was terribly strange and obviously had no grasp on the real world who used to be vampires, was Twilight. Weirdly enough, a text that I only included a small part of in my own study, but Twilight's popularity, when that really hit back in 2008, and we had masses of young readers wanting to read these books, and obviously the films that followed, I think that gave an insight to people who may have no interest in vampire studies or vampire literature or film. It gave them an insight into the dreamy possibilities of what vampirism can offer. And then those who had never read anything other than Twilight were given, hopefully, a bit of a gateway taste into the reams of other vampire fiction that had already existed in popular culture. I mean, Dracula had certainly achieved the classical status in the popular lexicon of being a great novel. So I think that, sometimes with time and a bit of understanding about what makes great literature, we change our perspectives from what is popular to what is great. And I think that only comes with time and understanding. But with if I'm kind of thinking about a vampire conference, if something's going on in the States in terms of a vampire conference, I will tend to always look for what is the core nub, what core questions are we asking ourselves as scholars about this? If it's to do with cultural history, or if it's to do with the ongoing mutations of monsters or horror fiction or horror culture, I'm going to be interested. If it's to do with proving the existence of vampires, unless you're actually looking at it from a folkloric practice point of view or burial practice point of view, I'm not going to really be able to speak to that, because it's just not something I'm qualified in, and I certainly have no thankfully first-hand experience of it. So it really comes down to discipline specificity, I think, at that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. I was wondering also about the larger question of sort of Gothic studies and Gothic culture, because I think that also means different things to different people. I mean, if you're studying earlier literature versus if you're looking at, say, you mentioned for a moment in the book Marilyn Manson and how he became sort of an emblem of that, even though that may or may not have been what he was going for and what his fans were going for. But yeah, I was wondering maybe first to clarify what it means to be Gothic, but also how that's changed in the popular discourse as well.
Yeah, I mean, the study of Gothic has very much been legitimized. I think been recuperated more so than horror studies, to be perfectly honest, because while horror studies remains popular, Gothic studies has a legitimacy back to these late 17th century in terms of how you think about instances of disturbance, whether it's supernatural disturbance or indeed, monstrosity or hauntings. I mean, you have that all the way back to Jacobean theatre as well with Shakespeare. So it has a legitimacy, and it has its disruptive capability is always uncovered and negotiated in Gothic studies. It just gets updated with our particular movements within literature. As such, then with Gothic, I mean, Gothic itself as a kind of a collective modal word fragments into various different things. You can look at supernaturalism, you can look at horror in terms of serial killers, zombies, vampires, ghosts, etc. Then you have the influx of cinema, which also holds all of this together. You can think about how these variations across cinematic expressions, basically since the beginning of cinema itself, you can see how Gothic and horror is always kind of worked into the DNA of these particular art forms. So Gothic houses a lot of different types of scholarly expertise across literature, film, cultural studies, drama. It's all a big, dark collective, I think, is the best way to kind of think of it. I think horror studies is still more to do with the excess, whereas Gothic is more to do with the idea of the containing of fright or the feeling of being delighted. And I say delighted in the sense of the supernatural brush with death, or the supernatural intrusion into the rational world. Once you have that kind of experience within the Gothic, and you get that sense of darkness that cannot be fully tamed or controlled. Usually with horror, we get the control element comes back in. Your serial killer is apprehended, or if he escapes, he's escaping because there's going to be a sequel inevitably. So we find that there's certain logic to the horror formula that with Gothic kind of always remains unresolved or lives alongside us, but is never fully subject to our laws or our rational understanding of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that Gothic enables us to do a lot more as a result of that. And then that's just as I say, that's one aspect of it. I mean, you also have Gothic culture, you've got Gothic fashion, music, obviously, as well. So it's all that brush with darkness. And the darkness makes you feel alive. I think that's always the thing that people think, that Goths must be very depressed or disturbed people. Not true. They pretty much, anyone I've kind of worked with in the Gothic, and certainly students that we have, they love the fact that they get to explore all this darkness, but it's done in a way where actually kind of empties you out of all your anxieties and enables you to kind of place it in a scholarly manner that you can feel there's pleasure to be found from it, and yet it's still contained in a very safe way.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if that makes sense. It's just trying to unburden yourself. You can unburden yourself with a good serial killer narrative or a good vampire story. It takes away that kind of the crushing realities, I suppose, that we have in the neoliberal age.
Yeah, well, actually, one of the things I'm always interested in with studying popular culture and with academics who do that primarily is how closely or how far the distance is between you consciously, as a person, as a scholar, and the thing that you're studying. Because I think it's become more acceptable to be, a big fan of something, but I think there's still a discourse in academia that, you can't just be a fan. You need to be somewhat removed from the object of study in order to really understand it or think critically about it. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about how you relate to Gothic culture, vampires, and whether you consciously or not try to keep some kind of distance between you as a scholar, perhaps, and you as a fan.
I do try to keep a bit of distance. That's not to say I don't absolutely adore a lot of the material I write about. I'm very fortunate I can do that. I write a lot about the material that I'm really, really excited about, whether it's contemporary cinema. I've also written a lot on Christopher Nolan, for instance. I'm fascinated with Back to the Future is another thing. I love time travel, so I write a lot about time travelers as well. And vampires and time travelers make complete sense in my mind because we're always looking for dislocations in time. I think it's quite interesting. Whether I am a fan of the work that I do, of the work that excuse me, let me rephrase. I'm a fan of the materials I work on, but equally, when I'm an academic, I do try and very much stand back from that and say, right, well, what is it saying? What is it saying about this moment? Because I think fan studies, as legitimate as fan studies is, I think looking at something purely from a fan perspective blinds you to maybe the greater argument that the text is making. Mm-hmm. A lot of the vampire material, as much as I enjoy vampires, obviously, some of it is incredibly conservative and will brush against some of my politics. Other aspects of it might actually be to do with, vampires are, in some texts are incredibly racist. I have a huge problem with that, or misogynistic. So oftentimes it shouldn't just be because I happen to like them that therefore they are representative of good values. Often they don't represent good values. I think it's more to do with the idea of trying to think about what the vampire's function is as a metaphor in that novel, or indeed serial killer material. I teach a lot of serial killer cinema. I certainly don't, thankfully, identify with any of them, but I'm always interested in what it says about modes of power, or modes of understanding masculinity, or understanding ideas around consumption or consumerism, or, as I say, disposability in the neoliberal age. Those are the things that really interest me, because it's all back to those discourses of power, discourses around disposability, and then that in turn drills into things around issues about race or gender or representation. Who has the voice, who has the power in that text? So that's where, as a scholar, I'm always coming from. I mean, as much as anybody else, there are films that I have rewatched thousands of times that I love every frame of, and to work on them critically often takes a lot more energy than working on it from a fan perspective, because critically I look at it and see a problem, whereas as a fan I don't see the problem because I'm in love with the material. So I think you always have to kind of know which hat you're wearing, and not to give in just to the argument that something can only be read one way. I think you miss out on the multiple angles that you can explore when you're wearing your hat as a scholar, rather than just as a fan.
Well, and that answer seems to lead nicely into a discussion of postmodernity or postmodernism, because we haven't quite talked about that in any detail yet, and I'd like to, because it's a big part of your book. Obviously, I guess it's very hard to pin down, but maybe you can say a little bit about what postmodernism means for people who maybe have heard that term but aren't particularly familiar with it, and then how you're using it.
Sure. So postmodernism, in its most kind of crude kind of way of understanding it, is that in a postmodern world, you are saying two things that would have been considered to be vastly unequal are now suddenly equal. So, for example, we're in the argument I'm using, you could say that Ulysses by James Joyce has the same cultural value and worth as Buffy the Vampire Slayer does. And that bristles with some people because they feel, well, no, Ulysses has had more importance to literature and to modernism, to art and Irish writing and all that. But what does Buffy do for the generation that consumed Buffy in the late 1990s? It speaks to their cultural concerns, their issues. It transformed television at that time. It reversed paradigms that had been entrenched in terms of horror studies, with the blonde girl who runs away, who now actually kills and stalks and sometimes falls in love with the monster, the vampire. So you can talk about, well, it's very, in some ways, very elitist to look at texts as having value or not. In postmodernity, all bets are off. Everything has equal value. It doesn't mean to say that everything is, to your taste, good or not. That's not the point. The point is that it all has a value and it all has meaning. And how that meaning is then arranged is how you would read it in a scholarly sense.
Mm-hmm. And so then what makes a postmodern vampire?
So a postmodern vampire, I formulated this idea based on two particular moments in time. That plurality that I talked about before in relation to the fearless vampire killers, where vampirism is not something isolated or secluded or indeed even the purview of the precious few, but rather something that is unleashed and takes on a global quality. It spreads globally, so everyone has access to it or is infected by it, whichever way you look at it. The other way to think about it then is that Jay Halberstam in their book Skin Shows had a fantastic way of summarizing it, which is that the postmodern monster, so that could be the vampire or serial killer, is no longer kept outside the citadel of human experience. We recognize them as human. And the frightening thing is that we can no longer keep them outside in the borders of otherness, but actually we understand them to have human traits and characteristics. And this is why we find them so fascinating and alluring, but also quite frightening, because we no longer necessarily always recognize the difference between them on the outside of the citadel and us on the inside of the citadel. So for me, what is that thing? What is that one trait that makes the vampire postmodern? It's subjectivity. It's the fact that the opening of Anne Rice's novel is, I see, said the vampire. So we're already in his point of view. We already, from the opening two words, we're like, oh, he's got a perspective. We're going to hear his point of view. He's going to tell us the story of his life. And this opens it up in such an incredible, simple gesture. It opens up this new way of thinking about vampires, where they're not just going to be chased down and killed at the end of the novel, but rather their perspective is entirely in parallel with human existence, and they're giving us their point of view. And there's something amazingly unknowable about that suddenly becomes so...
There's also the idea of a fixed and stable identity that postmodernity kind of eliminates or very much questions. And I'm thinking also about vampires. Like there may be people who say, a vampire has to fit these categories or else it's not a vampire. How do you negotiate the kind of, obviously if you're talking about vampires, there's something you're talking about, but I think we've seen in the works that you cite here, there are so many different versions of vampires that it would be hard to say, here are the defining characteristics. So I'm wondering, how do you negotiate something so movable and so amorphous?
Yeah, I understand. A taxonomy is such that I tried to deploy in the book how I would view what is a vampire and what isn't. I didn't strictly stick to things like blood drinking, for instance, because some vampires are the psychic vampires who feed off energy. I characterized Hannibal Lecter, who is a cannibal. That's exactly how Thomas Harris describes him in his book. Hannibal Lecter is very, very much informed by Dracula. And this is something that Harris later developed in his novel. So he's because he sups the pain psychically from Clarice in their exchange in the prison. So you find that there's some vampires, Patrick Bateman's another one, I think, who is very much about the idea of not having an identity. He's peeling off his face mask, as he says, there is nothing there in the Mary Harron film. And that gives us this idea that, there are surfaces going on, what we expect of what a person looks like or what a vampire might look like. But then there's the interiority that we're still negotiating and trying to understand what makes them vampiric. I tried to do it in this book in relation to the overt and obvious vampires, so the vampires that have lineage from Dracula and indeed earlier from Polidori, but this idea that they are always aware of their cinematic legacy. So in the 1970s, we have all this glut of Draculas that come out who are all crafted in an awareness of what's come beforehand, the legacy of Christopher Lee, the legacy of Bela Lugosi, back to Max Schreck. Their costumes are identifiably part of an evolution on screen. And that continues on when we get a Dracula. When someone is named even as a Dracula or a Drake or something, or a Prince Vlad or whatever it might be, it's always in dialogue with the history, that cinematic history that has come beforehand. And obviously the literary history as well. With vampires that are not necessarily from that mold, what I tended to do was, if they're called a vampire, that's absolutely fine, that's legitimate. I tried not to use aliens, or I didn't want to complicate it by bringing in like creatures from the other world too much, or from other worlds and places, because I kind of thought that would then try and complicate the soup a bit too much, because they're always going to be informed by a science fiction rather than Gothic approach. And I also tried to take into account that there were evolutionary differences. Some vampires don't use their teeth. They have tongues or spikes in their tongues and mouths that they use to draw blood. And that feeds back as much to the folklore as anything else, where there's been different folkloric instances of vampires around the world that don't necessarily drink blood, but they might draw energy, or they might drink sick fluids, or there's loads of different variation to work with. Because I was because I was focusing primarily on the American imagination and in the popular culture of American fiction and film, what I was trying to look at is what are the ones that have risen to the surface, the ones that have gained the most prominence, whether it's through popular culture and fan engagement, or indeed ones that have had a lasting legacy that has mapped onto the political imaginary of the period. That was my taxonomy. So it wasn't necessarily always about choosing the best, because that would violate the whole idea about postmodernism, but choosing the ones that were perhaps the most pertinent for that period, and trying to understand how they negotiate issues that have risen to the surface in all of these American presidencies. So, the distrust of the 70s under Nixon, and the corrosion within government, the lack of faith in government, the lack of economic prosperity at the end of the 1970s, and being stuck in the past that you're desperate to shuck off. By the 80s, you have Reagan, who reinvents the American dream, and vampires are completely reinvented in the 1980s, but we crucially have no Draculas. We've no European influence at that point. It's all to do with the American homegrown vampires that are typically teenagers. The 1990s, you get that split double. Vampirism is split literally into the vampire face and the human face. You have vampires who are completely split apart, in the sense that you literally have doubles coming up all across the culture. And this is very widespread in American culture at the time, where we have, as much as we have the public and private faces of public figures, such as OJ, Michael Jackson, whomever, you equally have with vampires the private face, the face that's held back, and then you have the public gentle boyfriend face of, I don't know, Angel or Spike or whomever, or Lestat and Louis, another duo essentially that come to the surface and represent those different breaks in character. And this goes on and on and on. We see these are cultural reactions that inform the vampires of the period. And in so doing, vampires represent explorations into that, how we can hook on to understanding one point of view over another. And I think that offers a particularly interesting dynamic with postmodernity, because with postmodernity, you don't have that sure-footedness that you would have in modernism, and you certainly don't have that sense of one being the absolute in the point of absolute right and the other not having a stake. I think it's really important to think about vampires always as they're unknowable, and what little you do know will always kind of secret more that can be revealed through their own narrative. Hence why we have so many, as I say, texts in popular culture now that says, I'm going to tell you the untold story of whichever minor character, and that comes to the surface to complicate the soup further.
And actually, so you conclude your book talking about how vampires continue to sort of pop up in new ways, which is kind of amazing when you think about it, because I hadn't really, again, thought so much about the different avenues for representing vampires. But like you said, this image of Dracula has been reinvigorated in so many different ways over the decades. But now, Trump is in the White House, and we have a whole new set of cultural concerns. It seems ripe for vampires to, take on those ideas. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about where vampires are now and where you see them going in the future. Like if there are any ripe for the taking ideas that haven't quite been sussed out yet, perhaps using vampires in the current political climate and cultural climate?
Yeah, I mean, I was sorry in a way that when I did finish the book, we were only 18 months into the Trump presidency when I'd finished the book. And, I mean, it was around the time that, Bob Woodward had just brought out his first book, for instance. So there were very interesting changes that were happening in the culture, which I had to unfortunately draw to a close at that time. But since then, I've kind of thought about, well, what's going on with vampires today? And two things have happened. The first is, and I end the book on this note, which is that what became a platform for vampire difference, for exploring unheard voices, for giving voice to minorities, voice to LGBTQ characters, and exploring that as an open-ended and incredible possibility for readers to hook onto and to identify with and to feel that they belonged in this postmodern world. What happened there in the 70s, the same avenue of articulation of postmodernism has now been, of course, hijacked in some respects by the alt-right and used in the very same way, but now against what they believe has been used by the liberal left as a critique against them for decades. So what you find is that there's been a sort of weaponization of all these various different voices, but now it's been used to actually silence them. So I think that vampires are now being used as, where they were once sort of seen as maybe not truth tellers, but definitely as voices that offered a plurality and a diversity. I think now they're not being believed. I think that's the next step. Their veracity is constantly being questioned. One of the interesting texts, I think, and I would have loved to have included it in the book, so I think I'll probably follow up at some point and write an article on this, is the vampires in What We Do in the Shadows, the television series, the American television series, which is just wonderful because, well, it takes the premise from the New Zealand 2014 film by Taika Waititi and Jermaine Clement. What it does is it actually brings a very American set of values to the text in terms of the vampires living in this incredible Gothic house, beautiful house. They're all different snapshots of particular vampire cliches, but then how do they negotiate living in the modern world of Staten Island and in our contemporary times? How do they cope with the promises and the expectations that they had of undead life with the crushing reality of the fact that vampirism is largely, for them, quite dull, quite uninteresting. They're trying to negotiate American norms, watching the Super Bowl, things like that, and they just don't seem to hook on. So vampires are constantly feeling a little bit dislocated in their own contemporary moment. And then because it's shot in the form of a documentary, you find that we are expected to take it as truth or receive it as truth as viewers, but then that truth is nearly always in a follow-up scene undermined or revealed to be actually not the perspective that we were given. So we're getting this negotiation between belief or subjective belief in truth and then veracity or what's actually factually proven. And I think that very much maps on to the contemporary moment in the United States, where the position of truth and speaking truth to power is a very unstable place to be standing at the moment because of various competing discourses you have in American culture, whether it's television or politics or protest or rising voices that have not been acknowledged for several decades. You find that this is still on a very unsure footing. So we've never really left postmodernism behind. I think we're now just seeing a full-blooded flourishing of it in the United States en masse.
Yeah, actually, I worry, I don't know if it would be a good thing or a bad thing to see like a Dracula version with orange spray painted tan and, running things from the White House or something. I feel like that.
Well, the vampires already made it into the White House. This is not new at all. I mean, there are numerous texts that position vampires, if they're not the president or the leader in the novel or in the film, they are the sort of Svengali figure that hangs, in the distance, or is the advisor who remains on the scene. I mean, I'm very confident that, some of the satirist programming you have in the United States will have not, if they haven't already done so, they will soon enough, in terms of using either vampirism or some form of Gothic signifier to show that this force, this malevolence, or this evil kind of influence is coming in some capacity. I mean, back in the 1990s, it was used in Children of the Night, the Dan Simmons novel, to show that around the Ceausescu leadership in Romania, you have it very much in his brilliant book, which is so criminally underread but wonderful, Carrion Comfort from 1989, which is all about the idea of this sort of elitist 1% who can control other people through psychic vampirism, but make them do terrible, debased things and rob them of their identity and rob them of their subjective voice and their cognition. So I think there's something really fascinating about that Simmons clocked, decades before it's actually happened. It's just been deployed in a slightly different way, I think, in the contemporary moment. So his work is very prescient on that they're already in the White House. I mean, we have had Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter,
That's
which,
true, yeah.
as much as I was not a huge fan of the film, I think it's a very interesting point of view that it positions itself as saying that, because of Abraham Lincoln, we have Obama, and it uses the vampire as a metaphor to basically readdress issues around the Civil War. While it's very clumsy in the way it's deployed, it's trying to make that connection between, if we didn't have Abraham Lincoln killing all the vampires, we wouldn't have had Barack Obama in power. And it makes this really kind of awkward kind of connection in its final sequence. So I think the line to the White House has always been fairly obvious, because vampires, I mean, again, to quote Nina Auerbach, but she was so right, vampires go where power is. The interesting thing now is that if the United States is in a state of emergency and in a state of anxiety about its place in the world, particularly after the Cold War, what's going to happen if there's the decline? Where are the vampires going to go next? And that's something that I don't really know. I don't know. I can't particularly imagine them going anywhere else, because they've been the greatest sort of signifiers of the 20th century, the American century. So where they go next is interesting.
Yeah, well, and I think that's, I mean, ultimately, one of the things that makes your book so interesting is that you lay out the protean ways that vampires have been able to come in and out of different cultural moments and reveal things that that highlight things that were already there, but also sometimes shed light on things that people weren't thinking about. And yeah, it's just such an interesting read that I'm going to continue thinking about as I have to watch that show, actually. What We Do in the Dark? Is that what it's called?
What We Do in the Shadows.
What We Do in the Shadows. Yeah. Yeah, you're not the first person to recommend that, but I haven't gotten to it yet, so I definitely will now.
As much as I am an American studies scholar, and I've always been, as an Irish woman who grew up in Ireland in the 80s and always had that kind of affinity with American culture, I think because Ireland and America in so many ways kind of built on that relationship through emigration in the 1980s. I think what's really interesting is that I know that there are certain touchstones in that show that I'm not picking up on that Americans certainly will. I'm confident that it will pay off for you. As well as that, it is just incredibly funny, and it shows up as all vampires do. When you get to that point of parody, it shows up all those well-worn tropes and cliches and ideas around power and influence and sexuality and all that. And it shows it up as, actually, the tragedy is if we got what we actually wanted and we actually got those powers that we desired, would we actually be any different? Because a lot of their immortality is actually quite dull. If you're thinking, how are they going to pass the time? If they've got hundreds of years on their side, how are they going to pass the time and make it interesting? And this is why I think that it's kind of like coveting the seat of power, whether it's a presidency or a monarchy, whatever. And then once you get it, it's the horror of realizing what you've got and what you wanted. So I think that's why vampires are fascinating, because we can't fully have what they have, but we think we desire it nonetheless.
Yeah, I mean, so much to continue to think about afterwards. I've really enjoyed talking to you about this book. I definitely, of course, recommend it to listeners, and I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to me today about it.
Thank you.
Once again, I just want to thank you, the listener, and everyone involved in this. It's a pleasure to speak with people like Sorcha here, who has clearly presented something great in the world of academia. Books are not easy to write, and they are not financially rewarding usually in academia, and yet I'm very privileged to be able to read as many as I do as a fellow scholar and talk to some really great people. And so I hope you will check out the other interviews that are available on the podcast and tinapp.org, where you can see more details about each interviewee and their book recommendations. And I will be back soon with another fantastic group of people whom I interviewed recently. Until then, I'm Chris Richardson. Cheers.